There's a specific kind of confrontation that terrifies narcissists more than any argument they've ever prepared for, more than any accusation they've rehearsed a defense against, more than any dramatic scene they've learned through years of practice exactly how to survive and even benefit from. It doesn't look like confrontation at all. No raised voice, no dramatic accusations laid out in careful, devastating sequence, no emotional confrontation he can twist, reframe, or use as evidence of your instability the way he's successfully done with every previous challenge to his control. Instead, something far quieter, far more devastating, something he has absolutely no effective strategy for handling, because it doesn't operate according to any of the rules his entire manipulative playbook was built around. This is how a super empath challenges a narcissist. And today, we're walking through exactly what this challenge looks like, why it's so uniquely devastating precisely because it refuses to follow the script he's always relied on, and why understanding this specific approach might be one of the most powerful things you ever learn about protecting yourself from manipulation in this relationship or any future one. Let's start with understanding why traditional confrontation, the kind most people instinctively reach for when they finally decide to stand up to a narcissist, so consistently fails to produce the outcome anyone actually wants. When most people finally reach their limit, after months or years of accumulated harm, their instinct is to finally say everything, clearly, forcefully, with all the emotion and specificity the situation genuinely warrants. This instinct makes complete sense because it's exactly how confrontation works with reasonable people, people capable of genuine self-reflection, people whose psychology includes the capacity to hear difficult feedback, sit with discomfort, and adjust their behavior accordingly. But here's what almost nobody explains clearly enough before attempting this kind of direct, emotional confrontation with a narcissist specifically. His psychology isn't built to process this kind of challenge the way a reasonable person's would be. His entire defensive system has spent a lifetime practicing exactly this scenario, learning precisely how to deflect accusation, twist emotional intensity into evidence of your instability rather than his cruelty, and walk away from confrontation having successfully repositioned himself as the reasonable one, the wronged one, the victim of your apparent overreaction. This is precisely why so many people report the devastating, confusing experience of finally working up the courage to confront a narcissist directly, laying out everything they've experienced with careful, specific detail, only to watch the entire conversation somehow end with them apologizing, comforting him, or questioning their own perception, rather than achieving anything resembling the accountability they were actually seeking. This isn't a failure of your courage or your communication. It's simply what happens when direct emotional confrontation meets a psychological system specifically evolved to survive and even benefit from exactly this kind of challenge. A super empath, having usually survived exactly this frustrating, invalidating experience at least once, eventually develops something fundamentally different. An approach that doesn't hand him the familiar material his defensive system knows how to process. This different approach involves several distinct elements, and understanding each one reveals why this method proves so much more effective than traditional confrontation ever could. The first shift, she stops confronting behavior and starts simply naming reality. This distinction might sound subtle, but it represents a fundamental change in structure that transforms everything about how he's able to respond. Traditional confrontation involves accusation, emotional appeal, and implicit demand that he acknowledge wrongdoing and change accordingly. This structure, however justified, gives him something specific to defend against, something he's had years of practice deflecting. A super empath's approach looks different. Instead of saying, "You hurt me deeply when you did this, and I need you to finally understand the damage you've caused," she simply states, calmly and without emotional escalation, exactly what she observed. That comment was unkind. This is the third time this specific pattern has occurred this month. I notice you become dismissive every time I bring up something that actually matters to me. No demand for acknowledgement. no emotional appeal for him to finally understand her pain. Just simple, factual observation delivered with a calm that gives him nothing to work with. This approach devastates a narcissist precisely because it removes the emotional material his defensive system depends on for successful deflection. He can't accuse her of being dramatic when she isn't being dramatic. He can't reframe her reaction as unreasonable when there's no visible emotional reaction to reframe in the first place. He's left facing simple, unemotional, undeniable statements of fact with no clear strategy available for successfully arguing against reality itself. When it's presented without the vulnerability his tactics are specifically designed to exploit. The second shift, she stops asking questions meant to produce understanding and starts asking questions meant to reveal pattern. This addresses something crucial about how conversations with narcissists typically unfold and how a super empath fundamentally changes their nature. Most people, hoping for genuine understanding or accountability, ask questions like, "Why would you say that to me?" Or, "Don't you understand how much that hurt?" These questions, however reasonable, actually hand him space to construct elaborate justification, redirect blame, or perform exactly the kind of superficial accountability that satisfies the question's surface demand without ever producing genuine change underneath it. A super empath asks different questions entirely, ones specifically designed to expose inconsistency rather than seek understanding that was never actually available to provide. How does that compare with what you said last week? What specifically changed between when you promised this and when you did the opposite? These questions don't request emotional processing he's incapable of offering. They simply calmly surface a factual contradiction, one that's remarkably difficult to successfully deflect, precisely because they're not asking him to explain his feelings. They're asking him to account for something verifiable, something that either matches or doesn't, with no room left for the kind of vague emotional reframing that usually rescues him from accountability. This shift matters enormously because it removes his ability to redirect the conversation toward his own feelings, his own difficult past, his own struggle to communicate, all the familiar detours that traditional confrontation almost always ends up traveling down. A question about pattern and inconsistency has nowhere else to go except toward the specific factual gap it's actually pointing at. The third shift, she stops requiring an immediate response. This might be the most disorienting shift of all for a narcissist accustomed to controlling the pace of every interaction. Traditional confrontation tends to happen in a single emotionally charged conversation, one where both people are expected to reach some kind of resolution before the interaction ends. An apology, an explanation, a promise, something that closes the loop and allows everyone to move forward. This structure, again, plays directly into his strength because he's exceptionally skilled at producing exactly enough surface-level resolution to end an uncomfortable conversation, regardless of whether anything underneath it has actually changed. A super empath removes this pressure entirely. She names the observation, she asks the pattern-revealing question, and then she simply lets it sit. She doesn't need him to respond immediately. She doesn't need the conversation to reach a tidy conclusion before she's willing to move forward with her own day. This absence of urgency is deeply unfamiliar territory for someone who has always relied on controlling the timeline of every difficult exchange, and it strips him of one of his most reliable tools, the ability to rush toward whatever resolution best serves his own comfort before genuine reflection has any chance to occur. Together, these three shifts begin to reveal something that goes far beyond simple communication technique. They reveal a fundamentally different relationship to the entire process of being challenged, one that no longer requires his participation, his understanding, or his cooperation in order to function completely. And this is only the beginning of what makes this particular kind of challenge so uniquely, permanently devastating to everything his control has always depended on. The fourth shift builds directly on everything we've just discussed, and it might be the one that ultimately costs a narcissist the most, because it targets something he depends on even more heavily than immediate resolution: an audience for his performance. The fourth shift, she stops reacting in front of other people. Throughout most narcissistic relationships, a significant portion of the manipulation happens not in private, but in front of witnesses, family gatherings, social events, mutual friends, professional settings. This isn't incidental, it's strategic, whether consciously calculated or simply instinctive after years of practice, because an audience changes everything about how confrontation functions. In front of other people, a narcissist can perform reasonableness while subtly provoking you, knowing that your emotional reaction, if it comes, will be witnessed and judged by people who don't have the full context. People who will likely interpret your visible distress as evidence of exactly the instability he spent years quietly suggesting you struggle with. This is one of the cruelest, most effective tools in his entire arsenal, because it means the same provocation that would read as obvious cruelty in private becomes, with witnesses present, a stage on which your reaction gets scrutinized instead of his behavior. A super empath eventually learns to recognize this dynamic with total clarity, and her response is precise. She simply refuses to react visibly, regardless of the audience, regardless of how carefully calibrated the provocation might be. This doesn't mean she pretends nothing happened. It means she declines to perform distress for an audience that was never actually going to hold him accountable anyway. She might address what occurred later, privately, calmly, with the same factual observation we discussed earlier. But in the moment, in front of witnesses he's counting on to misread her reaction, she offers nothing for anyone to misinterpret. This is deeply disorienting for a narcissist who has built entire strategies around exactly this dynamic. Provoke in public, watch her react, let the audience quietly form their own conclusions about who's actually the difficult one in this relationship. When the provocation lands and produces nothing, no visible reaction, no audience confirmation of the narrative he's been carefully constructing, he's left holding a strategy that suddenly has nowhere to go. Worse, from his perspective, the absence of her reaction sometimes makes his own behavior more visible rather than less, because without her distress to redirect attention toward, witnesses occasionally notice, for the first time, exactly what he actually said or did. The fifth shift, she stops trying to make the consequence proportional to his understanding. This element addresses something subtle but crucial about how a super empath's boundaries actually function once they're fully developed. Most people, even after recognizing a pattern of harmful behavior clearly, still feel some instinct to calibrate their response according to how much the other person seems to understand or intend the harm they're causing. This instinct shows up as thoughts like, well, he probably doesn't realize how much that affects me, or maybe if I explain it more clearly this time, the consequence won't need to be as significant. A super empath eventually releases this instinct entirely, not out of cruelty, but out of hard-earned recognition that his understanding, or lack of it, was never actually the deciding factor in how much harm his behavior caused her. This shift matters enormously because it means her boundaries and consequences stop being contingent on his comprehension, his intent, or his eventual acknowledgement. If a specific behavior crosses a line, the consequence follows, regardless of whether he seems to grasp why, regardless of how convincingly he performs confusion or genuine ignorance about the impact of what he did. This is deeply unsettling for a narcissist accustomed to negotiating the severity of consequences through exactly this kind of performed misunderstanding. Historically, "I didn't realize" or "I didn't mean it that way" has functioned as a reliable tool for softening whatever response his behavior might otherwise produce. A super empath who no longer requires his understanding before enforcing a consequence removes this tool completely. The consequence simply follows the behavior, cleanly, consistently, regardless of whatever explanation or confusion he offers in response. The sixth shift, she becomes selectively, strategically transparent about what she's actually noticed. This element ties together much of what we've discussed throughout this entire conversation because it involves a specific kind of disclosure that differs significantly from either full confrontation or complete silence. A super empath, having spent considerable time quietly observing patterns, rather than confronting each individual incident in real time, eventually reaches moments where she chooses to reveal, deliberately and specifically, exactly how much she's actually seen. This isn't the same as the emotional, comprehensive confrontation we discussed at the beginning of this conversation, the kind that hands a narcissist familiar material to deflect. It's something more targeted, more surgical. She might simply say, without elaboration, "I've noticed this happens every time I mention wanting more independence." Or, "This is the fourth time you've told me a different version of the same story." She offers this observation once clearly, without extensive justification or emotional appeal, and then she stops talking. This selective transparency is devastating precisely because it reveals, without warning, that she's been tracking far more than he ever realized, that her apparent calm throughout previous incidents was never actually confusion or naivety, but careful, ongoing observation he had no idea was accumulating into a complete, coherent picture. This revelation often produces genuine shock because it contradicts whatever assumption he'd built about how much she was actually noticing or understanding throughout the relationship. This is where the true power of a super empath's approach finally becomes fully visible, because it reveals that everything we've discussed throughout this conversation, the calm observation, the pattern focused questions, the refusal to perform for an audience, the consequences delivered independent of his understanding, was never actually passive. It was active, ongoing, deliberate collection of exactly the evidence he assumed she was too overwhelmed, too invested, or too naive to be gathering in the first place. And this brings us to something crucial about what all six of these shifts ultimately accomplish together. Something that goes far beyond simply protecting her in this specific relationship, into territory that reveals exactly why a fully developed super empath becomes someone a narcissist has no effective long-term strategy for handling at all. Because here's what finally becomes clear once you understand all six of these shifts working together, rather than as isolated tactics. A super empath doesn't challenge a narcissist by trying to win an argument he's spent his entire life learning how to win. She challenges him by refusing to play the game in the first place, replacing it with something his psychology has genuinely no framework for processing. Think about what this actually means for him, moment to moment, once he encounters this approach fully developed. Every tool in his arsenal depends on a specific kind of engagement. Emotional reactivity he can twist, urgency he can exploit, an audience he can manipulate, confusion he can leverage into softened consequences, a hunger for his understanding that keeps her explaining and re-explaining indefinitely. A super empath who has fully integrated these six shifts offers him none of this, not because she's suppressing genuine feeling, but because she's learned, through painful experience, that feeling and reaction don't have to arrive on the same timeline, in the same room, or according to his preferred schedule. This is precisely why this particular kind of challenge proves so much more devastating than any confrontation could ever be. Confrontation, no matter how justified, still centers him. It still requires him to be present, to respond, to participate in some way, which means it still ultimately keeps his behavior at the center of the interaction. What a super empath does, instead, removes him from the center entirely. Her calm observations exist independent of whether he responds to them. Her boundaries and consequences function regardless of whether he understands them. Her refusal to perform for an audience denies him the stage he's always depended on. Her selective revelations of what she's noticed happen entirely on her own timeline, delivered once without an ongoing negotiation attached. This is what it actually means to become someone a narcissist cannot successfully manipulate, not someone who fights him more effectively, but someone whose entire way of existing in the relationship no longer requires his cooperation in order to function. This is a fundamentally different kind of power than the power most people imagine when they picture finally standing up to a narcissist. It's not louder. It's not more confrontational. It's quieter, more contained, and precisely because of that containment, infinitely harder for him to disrupt. There's something crucial worth naming honestly about this entire approach, though, because it deserves to be understood clearly rather than presented as some magical solution that instantly transforms every narcissistic relationship into something safe or sustainable. This kind of challenge doesn't reform him. It was never actually designed to. Nothing about calm observation, pattern focused questions, or selective transparency has the power to give him a capacity for genuine accountability that his psychology structurally lacks, as we've discussed at length in previous conversations. What this approach actually accomplishes is different and, in many ways, more valuable. It protects her. It removes his access to the specific tools he's always relied on to maintain control, regardless of whether he ever changes in response to losing that access. This distinction matters enormously because it prevents a super empath from measuring her own success by whether this approach eventually produces genuine transformation in him. It usually doesn't, at least not the kind of transformation that would make the relationship healthy or sustainable. What it does produce, reliably and completely, is her own liberation from the specific mechanisms that used to keep her trapped, confused, and constantly explaining herself to someone who was never actually listening in the way genuine listening requires. This is ultimately why this particular kind of challenge represents something closer to graduation than confrontation. A super empath who has developed these 6 shifts isn't trying to win a fight within the relationship anymore. She's demonstrating through her own behavior that she's already outgrown the entire framework the relationship was built on, that she no longer requires his understanding, his accountability, or his genuine change in order to protect herself completely and consistently. And here's what happens, almost universally, once a narcissist encounters this fully developed version of a super empath's response. He doesn't rise to meet her. He can't, because rising to meet her would require exactly the psychological capacities his entire personality structure was built to avoid developing. Instead, he typically does one of 2 things. He either escalates dramatically, throwing increasingly desperate versions of his old tactics at a wall that simply stopped absorbing them, revealing through this escalation exactly how disoriented he's become by her transformation. Or he withdraws, redirecting his energy towards someone whose reactions remain readable, predictable, and exploitable in the ways his tools were always designed to exploit. Either response confirms the same underlying truth that her development, her calm, her pattern recognition, her selective transparency have genuinely, permanently changed what this relationship can offer him. He's no longer interacting with someone who needs him to understand her pain before she'll protect herself from causing it. He's interacting with someone who has already, completely, moved beyond needing anything from him at all. This is how a super empath challenges a narcissist, and it's worth understanding clearly why this challenge succeeds where direct confrontation so often fails. It was never actually built to change him. It was built to finally, completely free her from needing him to change in order to be safe, to be at peace, to be genuinely, sustainably whole. She doesn't win the argument. She simply quietly stops needing to have it. And in a relationship built entirely on his need for engagement, her complete lack of need for it isn't just a challenge.